The deadliest influenza pandemic in history began in 1918 and tainted around 33% of the total populace, or roughly 500 million individuals. In spite of the fact that appraisals shift, it is accepted that the Spanish influenza murdered around 50 million individuals, including very nearly 700,000 Americans. The principal wave of the flu happened in spring 1918, and it was commonly mellow. The subsequent wave was profoundly infectious and hit the world furiously. The Spanish influenza was at first found in Europe, the United States, and Asia before spreading over the globe. Survivors of the flu were biting the dust inside hours and long stretches of creating indications. The normal life expectancy in the US had diminished by 12 years after the Spanish influenza had been around for just a single year. In 1855, during the Xianfeng Emperor's rule of the Qing line, the third plague pandemic started in China. This lethal bubonic plague inevitably went through India and Hong Kong, slaughtering at any rate 12–15 million individuals. India endured the most losses with in excess of 10 million passings. This was the third major bubonic plague episode to hit European culture. The infection was at first spread by insects during a mining blast in Yunnan, China. Losses from the third plague pandemic dropped to less than 200 every year in 1960. Around then, the World Health Organization confirmed that the plague was not, at this point, dynamic. One of the most destroying pandemics in history was the Great Bubonic Plague, otherwise known as the Dark Death, in the mid-1300s. A savage flare-up of the bubonic plague began in China during the 1330s. As the nation was one of the busiest exchanging countries, the sickness immediately spread elsewhere. By 1347, the Black Death had shown up in Europe after a few contaminated boats docked at Messina, a Sicilian port. Only 5 years after the fact, the plague had slaughtered more than 20 million individuals in Europe. The Black Death is generally accepted to have been brought about by Yersinia pestis microorganisms. The malady for the most part spread to individuals from the chomps of contaminated rodents and bugs. From that point, it was profoundly irresistible among people. As a major aspect of the Second Plague pandemic, the Great Plague of 1665 made pioneers close all open diversion and seal the wiped out in their homes to help forestall the spread of the malady. Taking all things together, London lost about 15% of its populace. Despite the fact that the city recorded around 69,000 passings, the genuine number is accepted to be more than 100,000. At the point when the plague showed up in a family unit, a red cross was painted on the entryway with the words, "Master, show leniency toward us." Later, the dormant bodies were expelled and taken in a truck to a plague pit. In the 20th century, the second significant flu pandemic was the Asian influenza of 1957, otherwise known as the Asian influenza pandemic. The episode was answerable for more than 1 million passings. Toward the start of the Asian influenza pandemic, the infection spread all through China and the encompassing areas. Months after the fact, this season's flu virus had arrived at the United States and was far-reaching in the United Kingdom. Only 3 months into 1958, the United States had assessed that about 70,000 passings were connected to the Asian influenza. An immunization was in the long run built up that contained the pandemic. Perhaps the deadliest pandemic in history is additionally one of the most seasoned. The Antonine Plague happened in 165–180 and eventually ended the lives of around 5 million individuals. The Romans carried the infection back home with them after a war with the Parthians. The sickness began in Asia Minor and afterward spread to Greece and Italy. For the following 2 decades, the Roman Empire saw an episode not at all like anything they had ever experienced. At the pinnacle of the spread, they were seeing around 2,000 fatalities for each day. It was assessed that 7–10% of the whole Roman Empire was slaughtered, with higher rates in denser territories. For quite a long time, smallpox was a threat in Europe, Asia, and Arabia. 3 of each 10 contaminated individuals kicked the bucket. The principal European wayfarers carried the infection to the New World, where individuals were not resistant to the ailment. The individuals of cutting-edge Mexico and the United States saw demise rates a lot higher than those of the Old World. A few episodes of smallpox were viewed as scourges. Here, we'll talk about the one of every 1,520 that crushed the Aztec Empire. In any case, in general, the spread of the illness over the globe made it a pandemic. In North and South America, smallpox took roughly 100 years to pulverize around 90% of the indigenous individuals. In Mexico, the populace dropped to 1 million individuals from around 11 million preceding the European triumph. At last, the destructive infection helped the Spanish to overcome the Aztecs and Incas in light of the fact that their populaces scarcely existed gratitude to the illness. The deadliest of the 7 cholera flare-ups was the third significant flare-up that kept going from 1852 to 1860. Much the same as the initial 2 pandemics, the third began in India and spread all through Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. In 1854, the most noticeably terrible year, cholera slaughtered 23,000 individuals in Great Britain. Around 10,000 of those casualties were from London. During the third cholera pandemic, around 1 million individuals lost their lives. Numerous passings originated from Russia, Chicago, Tokyo, Spain, Venezuela, and Brazil. Tainted water was believed to be the reason for cholera. The Russian influenza, otherwise known as Asiatic influenza, was a fatal flu pandemic that slaughtered roughly 1 million individuals around the world. The flare-up began spreading in 1889 and was the biggest 19th-century scourge of flu. It was likewise the primary genuine pestilence that occurred in the time of bacteriology. The underlying cases were accounted for in Bokhara in Central Asia, Turkestan, Athabasca in northwestern Canada, and Greenland. Inside a half-year, the malady had contaminated St. Petersburg, Russia. Just 4 months after the fact, the flu had spread all through the northern half of the globe. Quick populace development in urban zones over the globe assisted with making a pandemic. Infection, otherwise known as Hansen's sickness, is a moderate creating bacterial illness that can prompt harm of the nerves, skin, eyes, and respiratory tract. Those tainted by the infection may encounter poor vision and muscle shortcoming. A few patients can no longer feel torment, which may bring about the halfway loss of furthest points. The illness has influenced people for a large number of years, however it turned into a pandemic in Europe during the Middle Ages. As they were esteemed to be unclean, contaminated people needed to wear certain dress or a ringer to flag their appearance. In any case, they were taboo to go to numerous areas. It is accepted that around 19,000 pariah houses existed in Europe during this time. Called the living dead, outsiders were connected to sin and proclaimed legitimately dead by city pioneers who seized the assets of the debilitated. There are still around 200,000 instances of sickness a year, however it would now be able to be restored with prescription. In any case, a few patients need progressing treatment for difficulties like visual impairment and loss of motion. Thanks for watching and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.